laaste sessie van Nasie in Gesprek vir 2026. Ek dink ons het 'n goeie week agter die rug van sessies. Ons het regtig interessante gesprekke gehad wat julle na die tyd weer aanlyn kan gaan kyk. Vandag se tema gaan oor handelsoorloë, tariewe as ook geleenthede. In 'n wêreld soos waar ons vandag lewe waar daar 'n toenemende geopolitiese spanning en handelsbeperkings is die marktoegang nie altyd vanselfsprekend nie. En die fokus ons vandag op hoe internasionale gebeurtenisse ons uitvoermarkte beïnvloed en hoe dit ook ons Suid-Afrikaanse produsente beïnvloed. So ons gaan nou kyk na 'n inleidende video en dan gaan ons oorgie aan die paneel vir die gesprekvoering. Baie dankie.
South African agriculture does not operate in isolation. It competes and trades on a global stage, a stage shaped by shifting alliances, rising protectionism, and increasing uncertainty. In recent years, global trade has become more fragmented. Tariffs are shifting, trade agreements are evolving, and geopolitical tensions are reshaping long-standing relationships. From regional conflicts to supply chain disruptions to changing market access conditions, the rules of trade are no longer stable.
Geopolitics, unpredictability and volatility in the market has become a new normal. Whilst we want to export to various destinations, it's also important that governments on both sides build together trade frameworks. And one biggest challenge we have these days is that we used to rely on frameworks created by the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which provided guidelines in terms of how trade takes place. It makes for predictability and some sort of rule system that can be used to ensure that obligations and responsibilities from one trade partner to another are able to give some sort of dependent system for growers, for traders on both sides to be able to rely on and send their produce to those destinations. Gradually, you are seeing the decimation of the WTO slowly but surely, and ultimately it's almost that the rules-based system is falling apart. And it's the same now that we see with the UN and all the other UN-related bodies.
What this highlights is just how exposed South African agriculture is to global markets. In many sectors, a significant share of production is destined for export, which means global shifts are not distant, they're immediate. And in this environment, competitiveness becomes critical. Of course, competitiveness is not only determined by price, it depends on the strength of the entire system, from infrastructure to logistics, to biosecurity, to resource management. And when these systems are under pressure, market access becomes harder to secure and to sustain.
Wel, politici is uit die aard van die saak die grootste risiko. Maar ons het die politici ook nodig, want hulle is verantwoordelik vir tariewe. Maar daarbenewens in Suid-Afrika is dit die gebrek aan behoorlike paaie en die swak toestand van ons hawens, wat wel verbeter het, maar danksy privatisering. Die landbou, voedsel, het verlede jaar 1 triljoen rand van huishoudelike besteding beloop. Die vraag is daarso, ons het nou nuwe handelsvennote gekry, ons het die steenvrugte uitvoere na China beding, ons uitvoere na Amerika, daardie tariewe is ook nou verlaag, so daar is baie geleenthede wat nou voorlê. Ek glo dat die syfers wat ek nou gaan noem, ook deel is van die ammunisie van die georganiseerde landbou, wanneer hulle met die regering gaan gesels oor forme van bystand, veral met die infrastruktuur. En dit is die feit dat die landbou en verwerkte voedsel nou vir voertuie en onderdele verbygesteek het as die derde belangrikste verdiener van buitelandse valuta, 40 miljard rand se uitvoere in die eerste 2 maande van verjaar. En 'n bydra die surplus, handelssurplus wat deur landbou verdien is. En dit is iets wat mens kan gebruik in hierdie onderhandelinge, dat hulle net besef hoe belangrik dit is vir ons landbouers om hulle produkte op die mark te kry en om hulle insette op die plaas te kry sonder dat hulle fortuin hoef te spandeer om trokke reg te maak. Ons kan dit doen.
And yet, within this uncertainty, there is opportunity. New markets are emerging, supply gaps are opening, and countries that can respond quickly stand to gain. South Africa has the potential, but potential alone is not enough. Because the real question is not whether global forces will shape agriculture, but whether South Africa is shaping its response. Are we proactively building trade relationships, strengthening competitiveness, positioning ourselves in the right markets? Or are we simply reacting to forces beyond our control?
Our diplomatic relations with countries count when it comes to doing business and improving our trade relations. And we've seen how it affected us, particularly with the United States in the last period of time, where the relationship at the diplomatic level or political level affected also the trade relations. And that counted also for the rest of the world in terms of their relations with the United States. So it's something that we have to attend to very specifically. We have a very specific advantage, I think, as South Africans in terms of the products that we export, but also the opportunities that we give for investors into South Africa. We all know that in the end it's all about creating jobs. That is what matters for South Africans. And the more exports we can deliver, the more investment we can bring into the country, the more jobs we can create. And if our aim is focused on that, I think we all have to unite and work together in various ways. The function that I'm looking at is particularly improving our political and diplomatic relations at the broadest possible level. And I think we can make a difference as far as the South African economy is concerned.
In a world where trade defines opportunity, who determines South Africa's agricultural future? Welcome to the conversation.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the session. My name is Nick Benadell. I'm going to chair the session with this panel, who I'm looking forward to working with. They have a lot of expertise, so I'm really looking forward to what they have to say. I'm going to give them each the opportunity to share some thoughts, and then we'll have a general discussion, which I'll lead, and then we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. But let me introduce the panel. Sitting immediately on my left is Donald Mackay. He's the founder and chief executive of XA Global Trade Advisors. He's well known for his knowledge about trade, and I'm sure that embraces the question of tariffs. So we're looking forward to your comments, Donald, and welcome to you. In the middle, on two away from me, will speak second, Wandile Shlobo, well known in the agriculture sector. He's a presidential advisor on land and land reform. He's also a lecturer at Stellenbosch, and is playing, I think, a significant role in trying to help shape policy in this area. So welcome to you, Wandile.
Thank you.
And then Ovi is two away from me, Seketwa, who is with the Green Bank, Nedbank, and he works in funding of farming in the bank. So we're looking forward to hearing about the dynamics of the funding of agriculture and the challenges of doing so in what is a pretty uncertain world. And on my far left, Professor Ferdi Meyer, who runs an institution, the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. So we're going to hear from him a bit about policy and the future. He deals a lot with strategy and future insights. So that's our panel. Please join them in welcoming them to the stage. I'm delighted that you're all here because you come at this thing from a mix of different angles, and I think it's going to be, in that sense, a productive discussion. Just by way of background, I'm a business school professor. I was the founder of Gibbs. You may know of the school, and my field is geopolitics and strategy, and I'm delighted to be back at NAMPO once again in Nations in Conversation. I've always believed in dialogue. The only way anything gets resolved is through conversation and dialogue and exchange of views, and it's an important moment. I'm not sure of all the topics that have been covered in the last few days, but it seems to me, and I'm sure easy to agree, that we're living in a very complex time where the rules of the game are not what they used to be, and understanding them well and playing the game is absolutely critical, whether you're an individual or a business or a sector like agriculture or even a country. Secondly, we are in a particular zone of uncertainty, I think largely created by the US in recent years, but there are many other things that are going on. So we have a lot of conflict at the moment in the Middle East, Ukraine and Russia. We pay a lot of attention to that, and in some ways that kind of takes our attention away from some of the other underlying trends, which we may touch on. But let me just share for a minute just one or two of those. You know, someone once said that for decades nothing happens, and then in a week decades change. And I think the last few years has seen that. Throughout my life, the United States has been the strongest, most powerful, most innovative economy in the world. I remember in 1990, the US was 4% of the world's population, but 28% of the world's economy. Think about that. And in the 1980s and 90s, in a place called Silicon Valley, the United States reinvented the economy through digital activity, which we all know about. And in that sense, it's remained the center of innovation. But as we all know, in the last 30 years or so, a great rival has emerged. I was living in London when Mao Zedong died, and the BBC had a memorial program to talk about his life. And the first thing they did is they put a map of the world on the screen to show people where China was. Now, we were ahead of them because we have always said, how's it my China, for a very long time. But, you know, I used to think Benoni was the Far East until I discovered about 4 billion people, all about my height, living east of here. And if you want to look at innovation and growth and dynamism, I urge you all to reorganize your map, because South Africa has come from a historical perspective from Europe, Britain, the USA. That's been our reflex, English language speaking countries. In the last 30, 40 years, there's been an extraordinary shift. First in Japan, then the other Asian tigers, and then China, and now India increasingly becoming a world-class economy and a huge market with 1.2, 1.3 billion people. So the shift of attention is really important geographically as you consider what you're going to produce, and if you are going to export, what you're going to export to where, and we're going to get into the detail of that. But I just want to spend a minute on some of the other things that are going on. The world democratized very heavily in the 1980s and 90s. And in the last 10 years, we've seen some reversal of democratization and populism and authoritarian states. And that's a thing for us to all be very conscious of. And I am going to say this to you. South Africa is a constitutional democracy, and a huge amount of value that's unseen comes from that simple fact. It doesn't work fully. Sometimes it doesn't work properly, but it is there. And all the rights and the courts and the media is free, and you are free to do what we want to do and express our views, which is not everywhere and has begun to decrease a bit. And let's hope that we go back to democratizing. So you're sort of in your broad, how the state functions is the political system. And we negotiated a democratic constitution, and I just want to remind you of that. Secondly, I would say there's massive generational change going on in the world. In the last 30 years, we've lifted between 3 and 4 billion people out of poverty. Now, in South Africa, we still have a massive question of poverty. We have 20 to 25 million, depending on a grant, which is not really acceptable in any society for the long run. But if you look around the world, there's a new middle class in China, India, Southeast Asia, a bit in Latin America, a bit in Africa. But this new middle class are often your export customers, because they can afford high-value products, and that is where we are exporting out of agriculture in particular. Interestingly, I'm not sure if you're aware that demographics are changing, that the rate of population growth has slowed suddenly, and all over the world, from India, Nigeria, to Japan, to Germany, the rate of population increase is decreasing, and it may well be that the world population starts to decline in 40 or 50 years if the trend continues. Women have just stopped having as many children. Families have stopped doing that. But there are many other things that are going on, and why I'm starting with this broad overview is to say these things have an effect on how we live, how we work, and how our societies function. Just think of how we learned to work during COVID with the isolation, certainly in big companies. That trend has continued amongst young people. And many people today work remotely because of the extraordinary technology that is now available to us. I'm sure you're all very tired of reading about AI, but I can tell you that ChatGPT is a very powerful source of information. And if you verify what it has, someone in Bangladesh has access to the same information as someone in Silicon Valley. That is a complete revolution. It's never been like that. Another revolution has been speed. Things happen so much more quickly. South Africa, when I was younger, we were about a year or two behind trends. Today, it's one click of the button. We transfer money, we export services. Services export is the fastest growing export globally, twice as fast as physical exports. You may know that. So today we're living in this highly connected world. What has happened with the US and the Hormuz, for example, is a trend towards deglobalization. Globalization maybe, and I'm keen to hear what the experts say about this, has sort of shifted slightly, and countries are now more worried because we're in a rules-based international order which was established after the Second World War. We created the World Bank, the IMF. America led this in good and bad ways, but America was the superpower. That has shifted. And now we're in a new world order whose full definition is not yet clear. I suppose it never is. But we are in a new environment. It's as though suddenly in rugby we allow forward passing. And the question, who's going to win in that game? So all of us are having to cope with this at a personal level, in our families, in our communities, in our industries. And I'm mentioning these because they lie behind what we're going to talk about today. I think triggered by the idea of MAGA and the success of Trump in winning the presidency. We all know this, that he had a 2025 plan, although he says he's not following it. If you look at the plan and you see what he's done, he's followed this plan. And this is not to isolate America so much, although it's tried doing that through immigration and other reforms, but also extending its power into other areas, which it's done. And the war in Iran is an example of that. So that dynamic is very important. South Africa is one of the few countries to make cars of an economy of our size. They were American cars for many, many years. Now we see Chinese cars everywhere we go. So it's Hilux versus Haval, I suppose. So just making those remarks, let me say that South Africa has always been a very open economy, financially and from an investment point of view. Compared to the rest of Africa, we have the most sophisticated multinationals are based here with all the benefits that brings. Sandton is the center of the center of the center of the African economy, and that's a massive asset. You may not feel it every day, but let me tell you, our banks, our insurance companies, our stock market, these are massive assets in a country of our income per person. So I just wanted to make those introductory remarks before asking the panel to share their thoughts. Our discussion focus is about trade and tariffs, and whether we are proactive or whether we are reactive, and what the outlook lies, and what the opportunities are that lie ahead. So I'm going to give the panel each a few minutes, and having made those introductory remarks, let me start with Donald to share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Nick. So last year, April, you might have heard of Liberation Day, the most inappropriately named day of the year I could possibly think of. But in that moment, President Trump walked out with this huge kind of cardboard print, and all of us were looking to see where South Africa was on the list before he announced us. Unfortunately, we're quite high up the list, which turns out not to be a good thing. But that really changed everything. And I think it started a new era, which even if President Trump leaves, if we have the most rational, just the best imaginable president take over in the US, an era has passed. And we don't yet know what this new era looks like. But we know a couple of things about it. And really what President Trump did was what many other countries have been thinking for a long time. So we're horrified because we ended up on the wrong side of it. But we shouldn't for a moment think that what he did was a novel and a first strike like this. It was just the extent of it that was so problematic. And so we talk about the WTO. I'm a huge fan of the WTO. I think it's a good thing to have a rules-based order. I think generally we prefer to live in societies which have rules and are well governed rather than to live in anarchy. And the WTO was put in place along with its predecessor GATT as a way to create an environment where the world was a little bit more predictable. And so you kind of knew what would happen. You knew when you sent your product to that country how much the tariff was going to be. The tariff wasn't something that was decided on a whim and generally not published through social media. There was a predictable process. That has ended, but the WTO has been on life support for a while before this. And I don't think the WTO in its current incarnation survives this. I think there will be something like the WTO. Maybe it won't have the same extent of membership. But we must remember bodies like the WTO really benefit small economies. They do not benefit the large economies, which is why the two biggest offenders under WTO rules have been the US and China. These are the problematic countries, and it's not in their interest, or at least in their very short-term interest. It's far easier to be the bully and just extract what you want. And in the short term, that's a win. If you're in the US, we're quickly seeing that short term is very short indeed, however. So to put some numbers to this, the US accounts for around 25% of the world's GDP, about 16% of the world's trade. The US is the most insular, but also the most lucky economy in the world. You're in a safe neck of the woods. You've got two neighbors who are not trying to kill you all the time. And it turns out that's a huge benefit. The US is also ridiculously blessed with so many minerals and good agricultural land and a great ratio between population and land size. It's a very, very lucky place to be. In fact, the whole of North America is. And so that's great. However, that 16% is extremely important. The US is not self-sufficient by any stretch. And rather than a process of deglobalization, I think one of the side effects of Liberation Day was a liberation from the dependence on the US as a market for everyone else. And so suddenly what has occurred is what I prefer to call re-globalization. As everyone says, what do we now do? The US is an incredibly unreliable partner, both for investment. You say, President Trump says to you today, I'm going to protect this sector, I'm going to put this much duty in. You decide, great, I'm going to put a factory there. Tomorrow he says, look, I had a meeting, we struck a deal, those duties are gone, we're going to move them elsewhere. So that is an unhealthy environment for investment. It makes for a terrible trade partner. And so we are seeing, it'll take a while, but we are seeing companies say, how do I reduce that exposure? And the problem with the US is you almost certainly can find another market, but it's typically not going to be one market. And so perhaps the US accounted for 80% of your exports, but now that has to be replaced with 5 other countries. And so that raises costs. Also, we, of course, see retaliation, some of it openly, some of it less openly, but the effect is that countries are going to become more insular, in my view. And when we connect that to your comment on demographics, I give a course, actually, on what is happening with demography at the moment. And one of the more astonishing things is the kind of split in the world between what is happening demographically. So in a world where populations are falling, global trade becomes increasingly important. You're either going to trade, or you're going to have robots do things, or you're going to deal with migration. Those are the only 3 options you really have. And South Korea currently has the lowest birth rate at around 0.7 kids per woman. 2.1 is the replacement rate. Highest population growth rate in the world is Niger, 7.1 kids per woman. Many women are on their 3rd kid by the time they're hitting 18. So you can see a problem on both sides. And let me tell you, Neither of those are a good position to be in. Africa has, on average, positive growth, but it's not positive in every single country. South Africa is kind of borderline, but we're replenished by foreigners, which periodically we seem to feel need to be culled out of the system. It's a terrible situation, but South Africa has movement into the country because although we complain about our economy, it is a lot better than many of the others in Africa. So predictably, people bring their suitcase and they want to go to where the opportunities are. The interesting dynamic in all of this is Africa is either going to attract capital from the old people everywhere in the East and West. In other words, if you have the capital, you make the Toyota Hilux in Africa, and so you put your money here and you repatriate the dividends, and that way you support. And we see this with Japan. It's been an interesting model, which is why Japan has been able to still retain a relatively good way of life without having tremendous economic growth. The alternative is you take the Africans out of Africa and you move them to your country to go and run your factories or insert whatever else. And so there's an interesting moment here. If the world is going to kind of pull apart from each other, as we appear to be doing right now, who's going to do the work? Because the labor is not distributed where the demand for that labor is. So that is going to have very interesting implications. And if we look out a couple of decades, we see very interesting problems developing. So, for example, Japan has real problems caring for its aging population. I have some slides, which I can't show you right now, of just some quite alarming robots that will bath your grandmother and do all sorts of other things. And turns out that people don't like that. And so what has Japan done? They've begun relaxing their immigration rules to allow people in to deal with those things. China's population is dropping rapidly, and in countries like Russia, which is just killing off their young men at an astonishing rate in a war with Ukraine, the situation becomes incredibly serious. And then maybe just, I'll close my comments on South Africa. South Africa is moving into its most protectionist phase since democracy. I think that is problematic. I don't think all of that protectionism is rational. It's driven by fear to a large degree. I understand that. Much of South Africa's economy remains unbelievably concentrated, with a small number of companies, very often monopolies in each sector, dominating. And the fear is if the monopoly falls, the whole sector disappears. Many of those monopolies are 100 years old. One of them is celebrating their 100th birthday this very year, in fact. And so there's a sense that we have to protect, and that instinct, whilst understandable, very often prevents its successor ever arising. And so we hold on, the sunset industries, which we never let the sun go down on, but consequently never allow the sun to rise elsewhere. And so I think this, by the way, is not just South African. Protectionism is a tax on innovation, and I think we're taxing innovation particularly severely in countries like South Africa.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tom.
Sure.
We'll come back to some of those issues. That's very helpful. Wandile, let's come to you. You've been in Agbiz for a long time. You know the sector well. Tell us a few thoughts from where you're sitting.
Well, Donald promised not to attack ITech about protection.
And I didn't.
Prof, let me. I think both you and Don made excellent remarks. I'm just going to make 3 points, building on the macro picture that you have painted, but taking us more now to the micro on the sectoral side. The 1 point is about the progress and the journey that you have been. The second point around to where we should be looking at, and I'll close off with a point about the constraints that I see. In terms of the journey, I think in South Africa, we have been on a fortunate position as a South African agricultural sector now, leaving all of the other sectors aside. Because we've seen, in terms of trade, the exports expanding tremendously over time. from less than 2 billion US dollars in year 2000 to over 15 billion US dollars last year, 2025. And all of this did not happen because we opened a lot of markets. There were a few trade agreements that we managed to secure around 2005 all the way going into 2013. And then we went on to a dry patch where we were not opening any new markets. We have, give or take, less than 10 free trade agreements. Yet we are this sector which we say it's export oriented. It's exporting over half of what we are producing. And I think that if we take what you opened with, Prof, that narrowing everyone looking inside, the risk you highlighted, what Don talked about, then that begins then to say there's a risk ahead. And what should we be doing? And that takes me to my second point then. And that second point is about what are the new markets that we should be looking at. As agriculture now, there's a whole trade-offs that gets to be done when we are looking at other sectors of our economy. And I still think that we can retain what we have in Europe, Africa, and all of the other areas. But Asia, as you were rightly pointing out, all of the demographic shift, the income improvements that we are seeing there, as well as the Middle East. And I know that no one wants to talk about the Middle East now because of the difficulties that they are facing. But in times of peace and reconstruction, and after all of these wars have eased up, that's going to remain the region that actually still needs more food. Each of those major economies, the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the likes, they are spending over 20 billion US dollars importing food each year. And I think those numbers will only remain at those levels when these countries are coming out of this. Then the key question is, what sort of relationship should we be having with those countries, while at the same time seeing how we sustain the other relationships we have? Don made a point that even before the Liberation Day tariffs, there were countries that were already using one way or another starting to close off their markets. The EU and many others were not as brazen as the United States, but they used a whole swift of non-tariff barriers that many people use to block some of the products from entering their markets. You might either phytosanitary barriers or whatever aspects that people put in place to ensure that you're not accessing their markets. We were up in arms when the United States was giving all of these tariffs, but some of the countries that we view as friendly, like China, in the farming sector, we were not talking a lot about the levels of tariffs that they were placing. If you were in macadamia, somewhere in Mpumalanga or in KZN, you were dealing with 12% tariffs. The guys that are in Western Cape doing wine, they were dealing with about 20 or 14% tariff, depending if it's bulk or not. So that's the level of protection that even the Chinese and many others were already placing. So it is only now then that we are starting to say, oh, we have a trade agreement with them, we must be friendly, but we are also not being frank about the trade-offs after this 2-year gap. So these are all of the things that we have to be thinking about as we are going forward. And I think the agricultural sector, we are sitting at Nambu here, as much as we get to be happy about the goals of our sector, but I think at times we will need to take a broader idea of saying in other sectors of the economy, our desires, what implications do they have for auto, what implications do they have for mining, manufacturing, and the others. So although we take a sectoral view, we will have to think about the other sectors of the economy. So as to where we should be going, I think that Asia, as well as the Middle East, is a new areas, but sustain all of what we have in the other parts of the world. I'm not as optimistic with the continent, at least over the next decade or so, because I think that the income levels are just not exciting enough for the high quality products that we are trying to put in other countries. So there is that constraint. Then let me come to my last point, Prof, of saying there are also constraints. You've mapped up and Don mapped up nicely about what we are experiencing in the world, others are doing. But also there's things that we have not been doing. South Africa, since the early 2000s, we've not really beefed up our capabilities when it comes to people that need to go out and open up new markets and negotiate trade-related matters for us. We are a bit more brave on standing on stage like this and say diversification is priority. and then we go home, we have dinner, we go to bed. But that's not how it actually works. There has to be intellectual capabilities of mapping up those markets, which BFEP and the others are doing. But thereafter, have the officials that do the groundwork of day-to-day servicing and making sure that we are reaching in those countries. And I don't think that South Africa, we've actually been doing that at all. And I won't talk about various departments, but if you can look at various ministries and look at how many people are actually responsible for trade policy, you will realize that it's very few people, and they are supposed to be looking after for the entire world. So South Africa, as bad as it may be, but I don't think that we have actually been serious about widening our export market. Perhaps Don, to a certain extent, is right on the point that he ended up with, of saying we've paid more attention of saying what do we protect, what we have, than aggressively looking out in the world and saying who's having what opportunities and how should we be engaging those people. And I think had we done that, he was going to link back again to your work in academia, Prof, of beginning to say then what should our foreign affairs interaction, our geopolitical interaction be with those countries that we are actually interested on. So I would say where the constraint has been is on putting the appropriate staffing, thereafter setting up the clear vision of which countries we are looking at, we're looking to expand to, but also have that conversation, not amongst ourselves as maybe sitting in government and every now and then engaging with Verdi, who's doing the work in academia, but also engaging with the business community to say, where are you guys at and what are you looking at, and see how does that align with the politics and the interest of the country. And I think that part needs more clarification. And that, Prof, needs clarification not only in terms of trade, but it begins then to shape your thinking even about attracting investments, about which areas and what should be doing. And I think that if we are to advance then on these conversations that we are having, we would have to go back to the economic diplomacy of South Africa as well as trade policy, and saying how do we retool that and how do we reposition it going forward, and what appropriate resources and human capital do we put in place to ensure that we are able to deliver that. Do that and make sure that it is in sync sectorially at a micro level, people understand what sectors and what's going on there, and then move up into the national level, and then we begin to engage on that. That's the 3 points I would like to open with. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Wandile. I'm sure we'll come back to those as well. Ovi, you're with Nedbank, a banker, just to remind you, and you're in the front line of funding this incredible sector. Share some thoughts with us.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. And I feel very lucky that both Ferry and Wandile haven't placed a constraint on anything that has to do with the banks, and I think that's a nice one. So I in my thinking, Prof, I started thinking about what does the history tell us about the tariffs and all these trade wars. I picked 3 scenarios that we've seen in the US globally where tariffs had been a key play. And I went back to the 1930s where you had the smooth Howley trade tariff imposed by the US during the Great Depression. The intention was to protect the US farmers and some of the goods there. It went the other way around. It worked badly for the US. So that's the key data point that we look at. Then came the chicken wars in the 1930s, or 1964, 62, 64, somewhere there. Again, US imposing, the EU imposing tariffs on US chicken coming through. And again, the results were not great. The intention and the results were really the opposites. And more recently, you go to the banana wars that we've seen, where the EU was supporting more their colonies, so-called, and the US came in to protect the Latin Americans. And again, the results are the same. These things do not necessarily help anyone in the end of it. So the question is tariffs, trade wars, tariffs, and what happens when you have these things playing out. And I think to the large extent to what Afedi is saying, these do not really help anyone in the end. They strive for innovation. They leave us to think that we're doing well, but actually it's the opposite. I also just want to touch on a couple of points that we might just need to look at. technology has been a key play in how, now bringing it back to farming, how farming has improved over the years. In the midst of this, one has to look at this and say, what is happening in technology across these tariffs? Is there an impact that it has? I think one nicely puts it that you have one issue here which has an unintended consequence on the other sectors. So we've seen the issues around the semiconductors in the US and China, which is a serious impact on the technology on the farming side as well. If you then think about what we're trying to do, and I'm trying to bring some of the key elements here, you think about technology and its impact on sustainability. These are things that we need to think about. Food security, as we think about all of those elements. I think these are things that one has to think about and say, are they impacted? And what is the impact that they're having on some of the conversations we're having and the tariffs that are coming through? Wandile is right. The EU has a very strict rule around where are these foods coming or the products coming. Are they in compliance with ESG and all of those things? Again, these are tariffs that are sitting there that no one is talking about, but they are real and they prevent goods moving into the EU. And rules, order, and predictability. I mean, I'm a banker. If you give me all of that in a package, I'll take it and run. But we don't have that, right? With how these tariffs have been playing, you don't have that. You have to think about what will happen tomorrow. You'll hear in the US they talk about the taco trades, which are things that are indicating to us that we really do not have the predictability that we need. And the way these things have been executed are leaving a lot of us in limbo trying to figure out what will happen next. And when that happens, the cost of doing any business, because the risk you're sitting with, exacerbates. So we're sitting in that scenario where you're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow, what tariff is going to come, and how do you respond to it, right? I suppose the outcome of that is in Asia we sit and we wait and do nothing, and that is not helping anyone, Prof. We talk about diversification of markets, and what I want to bring into that conversation is also the thinking around the products and solutions that we bring as banks. And I think if I look at what the banks have done in all of this at a global level, I think when the tariffs started becoming an issue, banks scrambled around what should we do? Because you now have this risk. If you can't have flows coming out of China, what are you going to do? So what are your clients going to do in the US going out? And in SA, we're worried about our farmers and all the agribusinesses who are exporting goods out. We're worried about that. That eats on your margins as a farmer. It impacts your business, your profitability. It impacts us as a bank. So we have to think about all of those elements in saying, how do we then solve for our clients as a bank? And so largely what the banks have done is to try and coil back on the funding to manage that uncertainty. And when you do that, you create a constraint in the market because there's not enough credit flowing around. And as you do that, there's an issue around interest rates, which are impacted by inflation, which comes with the price hikes, which also comes back to hit your farmers, your retails, and. So there has been that, and what the banks have done is to make sure that they start thinking about how their operations are impacted by this across the globe. In some instances, people are starting to re-rationalize their operations across. So you'll now see banks that were in SA coiling up to Dubai and the UAE so that they manage from there across the Middle East and Africa. And that's what we see. But what has been positive has been the trust that gets placed on regional players like ANET Bank, where people were looking at global banks, they're starting to pay attention to what we can do to help them more and more. And I think that puts regional banks in a much better position because we understand the dynamics on the ground and we can work with our clients much better. And NetBank has been very good in doing that, especially in the agri space where we're trying to solution and provide solutions for our clients to make sure that we fund properly, we fund where the funding is needed. And not only that, but we use our technology to give back to the farmers, to give back to our clients to say, this is what we see on our side, using the data we have and the data we're able to collect to inform what needs to happen on their side as well. So we've seen a lot of creativity that has been stated by all of these issues that we see on the ground. I'm not going to touch on the issues that Wandile is touching on around where should we go and all of that. I think we'll come back to that a little bit. But I do want to touch on this point that I think is very important around the African continent. There's been a lot of talk in Africa about the Africa Trade Agreement, taking out all the barriers and making sure that we are able to trade intra-Africa. And Wandile, I think the agribusiness, 40% of what we produce goes into Africa. I'm wanting you to think about this in the context of the next couple of years, because if we are already at 34, somewhere there in what we take out into the continent, is that not an opportunity that we should not miss as South Africans into the continent? Prof, you touched a bit on population. By 2050, the indication is that Africa will have the biggest number of human bodies. And I think Don touches, Fed touches on this. And not just that, but it is the most productive of those warm bodies that you have in the world. So we have to think deeply about that as Agri in South Africa, to start thinking and taking this continent a bit more serious. I think 34 is a good number to be pushing out into Africa. But can we prevent things coming out of India, things coming out of the rest of the continents into Africa, to manage those, take care of those opportunities? I think this, for me, is very important in terms of how we fund, because it puts a lot of emphasis on what we can do with the rest of the continent. And funding in this becomes much easier. The Africa Trade Agreement, hopefully, it will open some avenues for us to deal, Wandile, and we can move currencies freely. We can trade without using the dollar to trade. There is PEPs that is coming up. We're not sure when it is going to be functional across the continent, where we can use our own currencies in different countries to actually do the trade, which has been a big constraint. And if you think about what happens in some of the markets in the rest of the continent, you trade with them, you're doing the trade in dollars, but they don't have enough dollars to send out to you. And that becomes quite a constraint. And so we have to think about this as a bank to say, how do we then help? Because the underlying currency in all of this is who funds it and how do we move the cash around. If you don't have the ability to trade in your own currencies in the different markets, you have to use the dollar. That becomes an issue. Wandile touched on this thing of BRICS and how we see it. There's been noise around BRICS currency. Is that a thing? What will be the impact of that? Moving away from the payment systems that the world is using, which is MasterCard and Visa, by and large, and Union out of China. The EU is going with Wero, which is a new way of settling that they have in there. So all of these things are as a result of this uncertainty and predictability and the lack of rules being applied in how we respond to this. And I think all of these are pushing us in a place where we're saying as banks, in South Africa, I think we've been very fortunate, Prof, because our banking systems and our banks are probably one of the best in the world. So I think we're ready to fund because we have more data, we can work with our clients from an agri perspective. And I think we're set to fund the growth as we need it. I guess the question for us is, do we have the bravery to do the things that we think should be done from a policy perspective and from the people who must take the risk and give us the information to be able to fund. And that I think is something that needs to be looked at. Trade funding has been lagging globally into trillions. Banks are funding a small portion of that, and I think with what we're doing in South Africa, we're opening up those taps specifically for Agri. I think Agri has been well funded in SA, and Nedbank continues to do that. We're also looking at finding ways of making sure that we operate within your sustainability principles, where we're funding things that are going to make sure that there's no hunger in the world. SA is running a very good, important element there, where we're funding renewable energy. We're doing very well in those areas. These are things that we have not really funded previously, and they do have a big impact on the farmer's margin, because if you're spending a lot of money on diesel and all of those things, and now you have things that you can use using your energy, clean energy, and all of those things, these are moving us forward. And I think Nedbank has been very clear around funding these and making sure that we're in the forefront of doing that.
Thank you very much, Ovi. I'm sure we'll come back to those issues. Fadi, You're looking at the future. Share some thoughts on how you see the landscape.
Yeah, I'll be quick, Nick. I think that we can get some of the debates going here. But I think the one, maybe just 2 or 3 points. I think we need to understand the growth, that what has happened over let's say the last 10, 15 years in South Africa. And in short, we've outgrown our local market completely. If we would have had an economic growth rate of 2 to 3%, 5%, it would have been a different story in a certain way, that we'd have had a kind of a demand pull still coming. But I think often we underestimate what's at our doorstep now. We've basically closed the gap. This whole idea of import replacement, the opportunities in the local market. If we think we are here, Grain SA's, the NAMPO and the amazing work that's been done in the grains and oilseed sector. Let's take soybeans opportunity. It was just like this wild, big opportunity. We were net importers of the meal, we were net importers of vegetable oils. And all what happened was the banks, the IDC, the policies that all worked together. We got the crushing plants going, and we filled those gaps. So now we're actually sitting at an export parity situation. I think people often don't realize how big that jump is. If you're going from import parity and you're falling, suddenly you need to get that product out, because we even have more crushing capacity now than what we can consume locally. And that's in the grain space. Luckily for us, so the talk in the grains is all about being competitive at export parity. What are the things that we need to do? For maize, we've been competitive for a while in export parity, and our surpluses are growing over time. That's why we had the biofuels discussion again coming up. But it's not an agriculture discussion, it's a fuel discussion. We need to talk with the fuel colleagues and say, what can we do, what incentives can we drive? So bottom line is, we need to understand our markets and understand that over the last 10 or 15 years, the growth has been to fill the gaps quickly and to have the quick wins out there. And now it comes to the big exporters like the fruit. When we wrote chapter 6 of the NDP, it was relatively easy for us to understand which are the sectors where we'll add the most jobs, where we'll create the most value per hectare, per water, because we had idle water. There was still this market out there, and we could grow the sector. And despite of expropriation without compensation and all the political risk that we talk about actively, the banks and the farmers went ahead. And if we think about hectares, so let's say roughly 200,000 hectares more was planted on orchards. If we say roughly 1 million hectares, 1 million rand per hectare, that's about 200 billion rand that was invested at an environment that one would think politically unstable, risky, but the returns were there and the guys went for it. So the product, but if we carefully look at these trends, they are slowing down significantly. So we don't see the rate of expansion anymore on orchards, for example. So the produce that's coming, one dealer, we probably have another 20, 25% growth in volumes coming from high-value products, which is already planted, for example. So we need to find markets for those and reposition our product into markets where we have opportunities. I don't think it's too hard from an analytical perspective to figure out where those opportunities are. And the private sector is doing that for us very easily. They know exactly the fruits, the quality, grains, which markets, where to unlock it. For me, it links back into what dealer mentions, the mechanism. We're talking about it very easily. We're saying this is what we need to do, but what happens then? Who does the day-to-day job? And that's where our biggest problem lies. So if I would think strategically, NDP was charting all these opportunities, and we have achieved a lot of them. We didn't get all the jobs. If we think about our 3 pillars, it was high-value crops, exports, it was agro-processing, and it was underutilized land. Underutilized land still struggling. One dealer's working hard at it every day and saying what we need to do. The high-value crops, we hit those marks. And agro-processing, I would say, for the local opportunity, we are there. But we need to get those products out now. We need to get the processed products more into a global space. So we've hit those marks. What does the master plan do? The master plan, for those of you, and I see them in the audience that have been very active in those debates and discussions, it's all about the partnerships. We understand we need more than just the Department of Agriculture in the debate. We need DTI. We need DIRCO in the debate. But to some degree, Wandile, we're not hooking up, we're talking about it, but what's happening tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, that's not happening. So the institutions are often pulling along and reminding and engaging, but it feels to me that it's partly capacity. So we can talk about, are those jobs filled? And or is it ideology? And I think that's an interesting one. I think, Donald, you referred to it, the ideology of looking inward. And that is a big challenge. We saw it also in the value chain discussions in the master plan. The self-security issue, being self-secure on food, the inward-looking part. But it confuses a lot of the strategies going outward. And if you have those debates, if we are engaging in a tariff discussion, if we talk about tariff opening up of markets, the way that South Africa enters those negotiations is completely different than our counterparts. Let's take China, for example. Their direct subsidies are currently running probably between 17 and 20%. Direct subsidies to farmers. So in practical terms, for every 100 rand, 17 rand comes from the state in direct support, depending on which commodity are we looking at. In South Africa, that's not the case. So if we are engaging in an open trade discussion with them, our point of departure is completely different than what they are engaging in such a debate. So I think those are the 3 points that I wanted to bring, is get our house in order internally, get that tomorrow step going between the departments, and link back into industry. And then secondly is be very smart about our coordinated engagement with the market out there, because it's not fair. Let's be honest. It's not a fair and open market. We don't have the same benefits as a lot of our counterparts that we're dealing with. We'll talk about Africa in a moment, but let me stop there.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Ferdy. And thanks to all the panelists, because I think we've got some good food for thought here. I mean, it seems to me as a partial outsider to agriculture, this is one of South Africa's great success stories.
Yeah.
And it's sort of come almost, what can I say? It was not planned the way the auto industry has been planned and supported over decades. Agriculture is organized, but not quite the way banking or mining are organized. And so one of the things I want to share, and maybe you'll have some response, is the voice of agriculture, especially amongst the political leadership and state officials, the understanding of its importance, but also in society. That everyone's worried about food security or food inflation, but it's very difficult to communicate to people the kind of things that we've been talking about here, that are strategic, they're systemic, they're long-term. And I've watched with amazement in the last 10 years or so how South Africa's commercial agriculture is a standout sector. It's exceptionally capable and competitive, and it's achieved so much, exports and domestically. So there's so much to be proud of that needs to be communicated. Your point is whether we're coordinating enough, and Wandile's point is, well, what are we missing in the partnerships that are strategic, that are needed to bring the sector and the state and the logistics to work together. I watched Japan grow in the 70s and 80s, and the state played a very critical role in making Japan work, as did China. When you say China has 17% subsidy, remember that it's a state-controlled society. So the government just make that decision. We're a democracy. It's not so easy to coordinate. I want to start with a general question, and please feel free anyone to respond. We've been booted temporarily out of the G20. We were in the G20 for a while, which was an extraordinary thing. And now we've just hosted the G20. What is South Africa's bargaining power? I look at an index in the US and China that's called Calculating National Power. And it looks at a whole bunch of factors to say, You know, how many kilometers of road, rail, bandwidth, education, PhDs, research and development, industry. It's 150 items, and they rank every country. What is our power to negotiate?
Where do we rank in that?
Where do we rank? We rank about where we rank in our economy, late 20s.
Late 20s.
And you know, when we talk about trade and tariffs, your bargaining power really matters. Trade and tariffs have been used as weapons of political power since the hills were born. This is an ancient way of competing. I think what Trump has done is he's weaponized economics as a form of conflict. When he stood with that sheet, what he was telling us is he's going to war. And it has material impacts on society. So we always think of conflict as military. Actually, economic conflict is much longer standing, is continuous, and has a dramatic effect on societies. So any comments on South Africa's bargaining power? And I want to come to Wandile's point about what I would call economic diplomacy. When I've looked at other countries, the ambassador's right hand are all trade and investment people, to make sure that business is represented, both for inward investment into the country, but also for trade outside and investment outside the country. So any thoughts on what is our standing in terms of influence and the agenda? Where can we influence the agenda?
Can I take a swing at
Please,
that?
yeah.
So I'd start by saying that before you get to the standing, your economy has to be competitive. Like, there has to be something you're very good at doing in order to have leverage. South Africa's blessed with lots of minerals, and so we're quite lucky. We're pretty good at farming. That's another good thing.
And rugby?
And rugby. Let me just reorder the list. So the issue we've got, though, is that a lot of the fundamentals, the things that have nothing to do with one particular sector, are like a tax on all of the sectors. So, for example, our ports are a disaster. I mean, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. If it was a train, that would be good, because there'd be trains coming at least. But in reality, we have dysfunctional ports, some of the worst performing ports in the world. We have problems with electricity, despite the fact that we're not getting load shedding any longer. Roads, etc. Crime, and you go.
Infrastructure.
Just the list goes on. And of course, the worst of all is every business is in a municipality, and almost every municipality is dysfunctional to a larger or smaller degree. And so all of those are a tax on competitiveness. Now, there are a couple of ways you can approach that. The one is to say, well, we're going to fix the problem at source and sort that out. That's politically very difficult to do. It's far easier to just keep putting incompetent people in and letting them run as long as they are good at attracting votes. That becomes politically difficult to solve the problem. The other side of it is to do what we're doing, which Wandile would disagree with me on, but I think much of our protectionism is an alternative to dealing with the hard problems. So what we'll do is, you would have seen recently the talk on the ferrochrome smelters. The reality is we may have reached a point where we just cannot produce ferrochrome anymore. Maybe we're at that point. It is what it is. So what we're doing now is we're saying, well, what we'll do, we'll get everyone else to pay a little bit more electricity so these two companies can continue functioning. And then, of course, everyone else woke up and said, we'd also like a bit of that cheap electricity. And so you can't scale the problem anymore. And I think this is how we're approaching our problems at the moment, which means that our ability to have leverage on anything gets rapidly diminished. That only works when everything is inside your internal market, because you can block out the competition from abroad. You can stop the innovations coming in by taxing them highly enough or putting permits in place, whatever the case might be. The problem is that doesn't make you good at anything. It just offsets the fact that you're not good at something. And it shrinks your world to as big as what we are. We've got an unemployment rate which is, if not the highest, one of the highest in the world. Yet we do very little to deal with creating a productive workforce. So we don't treat education like something that matters. And I'm not talking about university. I'm saying half the kids starting school don't finish high school. Unemployed reflect largely that. So the unemployed are not just an even distribution, you're all the PhDs in there. It's not like that at all. And so we're not creating an environment where South Africa has leverage on anything. And now we're shocked because other African states are starting to be competitive. So, I'm a huge fan of the Continental Agreement, but the reality is we treat the Continental Agreement like a market we can sell to, but we're terrified of African states sending anything into our market. So, no one joined the agreement because the market they wanted access to was Chad, and that's the reason everyone signed up. We are the prize, and we're not using that in a way that makes sense. So what we're doing instead is just taking protectionist actions now against African states. And so I think if we're going to have leverage, then we've got to focus on the basics. How do we create a high-quality group of human capital in the country, etc.?
Lovely. So we can't have it both ways. We can't see Africa as a massive market, especially for agriculture, but actually have barriers. It has to be two ways.
And the irony, Nick, quickly to add to Donald's point, is we are outgrowing our local market. So this protectionism philosophy doesn't work because we don't have the market. The US has the market.
Yes.
China has the market. India has the market.
And it's what we did in the auto industry, is we created the incentives to become a manufacturing exporter of cars. And that paid for decades. So I love your point about the outgrowing our domestic market. And if you don't have economic growth of the Asian level, I always say that economic growth is the oxygen of a society, because that's where people have chances to be employed, to make a contribution, to have the knowledge. Growth is the oxygen of democracy and a better life for everybody. But we don't have growth. So it's a blocked supply chain in a way, domestically. You're right.
Prof, let's answer your question. Your question is, how do we compete, or where are we strong at?
I'm asking, what do we put on the table in terms of influence to negotiate?
So if for a moment we take a view that the future is looking towards Africa, then I think we sit at the pinnacle of that as South Africa. We have a very stable government. For all its sins that it has, it's very stable.
Great.
Very clear policy direction, and we can agree or disagree on what that should look like, but we agree in a manner that allows for things to happen.
The framework is in place,
as
a constitutional democracy.
We also have a very stable and functional banking or financial system, which is well managed, well controlled. And I think if you take that as the backbone, if you're looking into Africa, we then become the place where you start to get into the rest of the continent. And that is also true if you look at the FDI coming into the continent. Between ourselves and Egypt, we remain where the bulk of the money is coming in. You'll see East Africa coming up, but I think, Donald is right. We're starting to feel the pressure from the Kenyans and the East Africa from a technology perspective, but we remain ahead insofar as those are concerned. So I think those become a nice cocktail to launch us into a much more competitive set. I can't argue the question of politics and all of those. And I think, and I'll leave the rest to Wandile and the economists to deal. But from my perspective as a banker,
can I just ask a question about looking at Africa? You made the point about it's be the biggest population in the world. It will be the largest youthful population. But I wonder about the institutions and the infrastructure.
In the continent.
In the continent,
Yeah, I think that's where the whole Africa Trade Agreement becomes unstuck, right? Because then you can't find functionality in getting these things done. I mean, we took a while to just get to 54 states ratifying the agreement itself. But I think there is more political will, Prof, across the continent. Part of
is there what makes you say that?
No, let's look at what has happened. I mean, recently the president of Kenya and Tanzania are agreeing on opening a refinery in Tanzania, which you would never had between two African countries agreeing such. You've seen the developments in Angola with more power plants being developed, and you see all of these developments in these nodes, and Mo's discovered oil, and we're moving ahead to get those going. Uganda discovered oil recently, and they are getting skills to get that going. So I'm saying, if you are taking an optimistic view into the continent, there are nodes of excellence that are starting to show. And I think part of what is driving that is the need to be relevant and to take care of our own people. And I think if as SA we have a look, and as agribusiness we have a look at that and see this market as a market that we can play with. I'm not going to comment on the skills coming into South Africa, but I'm saying we have one or two things to do, and SA becomes quite important in how these flows are coming into Africa and moving into the continent.
I would be very interested to be sitting in Nairobi or Morocco or elsewhere and looking at South Africa and wondering how they think of us. And I'm thinking of the recent things about migration and how we treat people. But Mandela, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, let me make 2 points. One is probably brief and political, and 2, to clarify my framing of what am I saying about the continent and where is this somewhat pessimism emanates from. On the first, which is political, my assessment, I mean, about 2 years ago, I go to Lusaka with then Minister of Agriculture, now Speaker. I'm speaking for private sector, she's speaking for government. There's all of these continental governments are there. It's a World Bank session. My impression of what I was listening and people presenting the African continent and saying Africa, excluding South Africa, and the tone that we were getting did not leave me uplifted. That's the one on how, at least in agricultural policy. Why are we somewhat a bit more pessimistic about their growth in the near term? I do not think that first is the framework side of, do we have to execute this by 2030? Do we have all of the institutions in place to get this, to do it? Are the countries serious about doing this, or is it only just the political part of it? My sense is that, firstly, on the money that we get from the African continent, it is true that about 40% or so of our farm exports go to the continent. The revenue that we earn are from that. But 90 cents in every dollar is just from the Southern Africa region. There is nothing that we are getting from West Africa, the Maghreb region, and East Africa that is that notable. The folks are using the non-tariff barriers and telling us that our grains are genetically modified. Tobias is sitting right there at the back. He would be joyous to send 1 million tons of maize to Kenya, but the government of Kenya is not going to let him send that grain there. Then there's all of these non-tariff barriers. In SACU, we have our own issues, which John and I have talked about these, and he also takes no joy that I sometimes am hostile to our neighbors, which we love our neighbors. But sometimes they block our vegetables, block everything, and no one communicates anything.
And yet we're funding them through SACU. So
we're funding them through this revenue from, and then we always say it's only the US president that communicates also via social media. I'll tell you this, I've said in the past in some of the political offices advising some ministers, and I remember being in the office finding out on Facebook that the vegetables were not there. At the same time the minister was finding out. And the DG was in the meeting. So it's not, there's just no sync in this. And then at the same time, when we try to strike a trade agreement with anyone else, we have to go to sit with SACU. And I always don't get a sense that the colleagues in SACU share the same level of urgency to engaging with other people that we have, despite our capability problems. So the region is not as functional and as good as we think. Then there's a whole issue about the profile of what people can realistically buy. In the National Development Plan that Freddie mentioned earlier, one of the things we're seeking to do there, and where the incentive have to go, they have to go to high value products in certain part. The reason for it is because we're trying to create jobs. We are not growing the South African agricultural sector for the sake of it only. And those fruits and those meats that are going there. In some countries, the demand remain constrained because the buying power is not exciting for now. But in the long term, this is going to be important. We also must not let away the fact that some of these African governments, they earned money through the revenue stuff that they were getting on tariffs. And that conversation we will see from 2030 onwards. Let me close with this. And it goes back to this idea that both you and Don, you agreed, Prof. Don, you raised the point that we are somewhat getting jealous of what's going on in the continent. The problem is that in some of these countries, you don't know if it's country hopping or it's really stuff that is actually producing there. I mean, I sit in one of the organizations where we deal with the tariff administrations and all of these things of South Africa. You suddenly, one year, an African country has nothing. Next year, it's exporting so much glass. And then you go verify if there is really a glass factory. There is no glass factory. Then it's only sitting on statistics. Then at the months before, you had put a certain anti-dumping duty on China or whatever countries. So if the rules of the game can be fine, if China wants to support a particular country in Chad, they should go to Chad and open a yeast factory. We should see that the yeast is produced in Chad and then it comes in here. Then those things, we will not be as pricky as we are at the moment, because some of our actions are really arising from that. Let me also clarify one point also. And I'm not defending government here. I sit in no man's land. I don't. The key point is, we have to think also, where does the ideology of protectionism coming from? It's not only coming from the government. The business community also raises sometimes legitimately some of the stuff, or sometimes looking at their own interests. Sometimes it's legitimate. I mean, the wheat industry, they are flooded by wheat. There's all of these issues. Their cry is legitimate. Others, they may not be as legitimate, but the government is persuaded by the domestic businesses that are saying, protect us on this. So ideology is not one-sided. It's really the South African side. Then we should be thinking then, to your point, Don, because I think your assessment is correct about where we sit. How do we begin to have a paradigm shift of thinking and rather focusing more on competitiveness side of how do we get the businesses going in that. That would be my thinking, and that's why I was pessimistic about the continent.
Fair point. That's very helpful, Wandile.
Nick, can I put just a quick final nuance on Wandile's observation? I mean, let's talk wheat and protectionism, and I think that's the approach. It's a finer nuance on what we need to decide, how do we tackle these industries. From a wheat perspective, let's say roughly 50% that we produce locally, 50% is being imported. Yes, some of the global market countries are heavily protected. So global, and then there are different studies that you can look at it where these wheat prices could be higher, where farmers are kept on the land for very strategic region. I mean, we can literally go and have a look, why are these countries doing it? Why are they keeping their wheat farmers intact? And for me, it's a finer nuance between, just protecting for the purpose of protecting versus what do I gain or lose by losing this industry? Yeah. And I think if we can start to change that narrative and saying, what's the value of this industry in a certain area, in a rural economy, the multipliers, etc. If you think about the total package, then your debate starts to become different. And what you decide, what you want to support and say, this is what the industry means to me and that's why we need to keep it intact. Or, like you're saying, this is just blunt kind of the stuff that we see with many of our neighbors.
Lovely. Well, we've heard a lot from the panel. So let's, if we can, turn to the audience. And if you can just say your name and make a comment or a question. I see a hand up at the back. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nick. Specifically on the wheat, and I see Donald made comment in an article with regards to the backlog, with regards to the tariff applications. First question is an ad valorem based tariff as opposed to protectionism, a flat rate. Maybe some comments on that. We've been struggling for approximately 22 months to get any word of a price adjustment and a triggering mechanism in terms of the wheat ad valorem tariff. And I want to make the distinction between the two here today, that we all understand what we're talking about. Where not only the liquidity of the markets, etc., are affected because of the non-activation and announcements of those tariffs when they trigger, and your comments on that. And then also I'm hearing a lot of about job creation and strategic, Ferdy, what you said. In the week I heard a comment to say there are now more people on grant systems in South Africa than there are employed. And I think that needs to be the focus in terms of what we're doing in this country. Also, our grain on leg strategy in terms of protection for poultry, pork, and driving exports through red meat, I think that needs to be looked at. We have the ability, Donald, you mentioned it, we rank up there with the rugby. We're damn good farmers. We need to produce, drive the economy, and grow our economy. Perhaps you can answer those ones to start with for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good luck to pick up.
All right, let me...
And I'd just like to add before you go, we are triggering and going ahead to launch an application, a DAMAS application, against the Minister Parks Tau and the ITC as we speak today. Thank you.
We should have a cup of coffee before I leave to talk about that application. But let me maybe start with, in fact, building on a comment Fadi made. So we're, in some ways, like the parent who tells everyone how much they love their kids, take their kids with them when they go shopping, lock them in the car in the sun, and then come back 3 hours later with dehydrated, passed out kids. And so this is what happens here. We say, for example, the wheat sector is important. I mean, in fact, the whole reason we have a tariff on wheat and the way the tariff works, which we don't need to get onto, but one of the key things with the way this tariff works is it is meant to have a response that is very quick when global prices of wheat fall. Nothing is quick at ITAC, and this is a really big problem. The current commissioner, of course, being an exception, no doubt. But so the challenge is, by time a decision is taken very often, what ends up happening is your planting season has passed, and you get the duty increase, we don't need it, etc. Sugar is the same, and so on. That to me is simply inexcusable. That is not a technical problem. That is just an administration that is broken and needs to be dealt with. There have been court cases on this, and I've got to tell you, they haven't ended well. So there have been a number of them in the past. They have not ended well. So we must understand as well that you shouldn't make the assumption that this is an easy problem to fix if there's no internal will to address the problem. To the question of protecting our agricultural sector, I mean, every country in the world concerns themselves with agriculture because it turns out everyone has to eat, and so that's a really important problem to solve, whether it be through animals, feed, etc. The challenge we have, I think, less so ironically with agriculture than many of the other sectors, is so with agriculture we don't have the insane concentration. With chicken we do, we've got 2 or 3 producers that account for the bulk of it. But sometimes we can't figure out what it is we want. So I'll give an example. We have a 62% tariff on chicken, but we're shocked that the chicken producers don't want to export. Why would you export if you've got a 62% tariff locally, but when you step outside your borders, you suddenly don't have that? So each of these is a trade-off. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't have protection on chicken. I'm just saying you've got to measure the trade-off because there always is a trade-off. And I think we're very bad at doing that. So what we see in our policy space is we talk about all of the very important problems that need to be solved, but we don't realize that every intervention has other consequences. So we say, for example, I'm picking on chicken, which is a little unfair. 62% tariffs important. It is. It's an enormous agricultural sector, if not our biggest employer, I would think. But the problem you have is that also means people have to pay more for chicken. With a lot of poor people eat a lot of chicken. So all of these trade-offs very often are not considered. And I think this leads us into a space where our policies very often lose effectiveness. So the government keeps screaming at the chicken producers, why are you not exporting more? There are not that many chicken producers who are wild about the idea of finding those markets while you've got this level of protection. And maybe that's a good trade-off, but we don't very often acknowledge that those trade-offs exist, I think.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on the wheat story?
The difference in the tariffs.
And the tariff types
You can
ad valorem and so on?
Sure. Well, there again is a trade-off. Ad valorem duties give a very predictable mechanism. We've got commitments at the WTO called bound rate commitments, upper limits, which are set at ad valorem levels. So when you've got a specific duty, a rand per ton, for example, as we have, or per kilogram, I think it is on wheat, it makes measuring yourself against the bound rate a little more challenging. So I mean, that's essentially it. But it's harder to circumvent duties that are set at a specific level, because a ton of wheat is a ton of wheat. And it turns out the shipping companies won't allow you to put 2 tons of wheat on and call it 1 ton. So there's a kind of a built-in security mechanism there. The ad valorem duties, and by the way, this is a much bigger issue than agriculture, is an enormous problem at SARS. Things like undervaluation of goods. We are working with SARS to find ways to better address that. But those are really big problems. But so again, each of these, it's a trade-off. The problem you have, which is one last comment on ad valorem duties, is the duties reach their highest effective level when you need the protection the least. So when the price of the product is high and you're not struggling with competition, that is when the effective tariff is the highest. I mean, those are my comments.
Let me just say one quick thing. And I mean, I'm one of the commissioners of ITEC. My viewpoint and preference now, taking into heart the interest of the wheat industry, I would say going the other way of the ad valorem, just having that, is probably not going to serve you well in the long run. There are various limits that you will hit well. The current way of going with the variable formula is perhaps the most effective one. The core thing is about how do we trigger it effectively enough within a certain limited time frame. And I'll say this publicly here, that there are deep conversations that are happening around that, and we need to move on making sure that all of these are effective, because ultimately, either you are talking about sugar or anyone else, you end up with the very same scenario, curing a wound, buying a bandage for the wound while the wound is already dry. So that's the difficulty at which we are having in here. It's about streamlining our systems in all of these things.
Yeah, I think, Richard, just quickly to add, I think it's a pity that we'll have to ask that question because the system is broken. It's the inefficiency. We shouldn't actually even be asking that question. Because it's actually the logic behind it, exactly Donald's point, is you don't want, if the world price runs to 300, 320, 330, the wheat farmers are, we can deal with that. But we can't deal with 240 and 220 and 210. And that's where we need that barrier. So now it's, unfortunately, we're asking the question because the system's broken. Again, it gets back to my first point is, the step, what happens tomorrow, what happens the day after. That's where we're not good at.
Very good. All right, let's take, I'm going to take a question from the lady in the front and then the gentleman at the back.
Oh, that's me.
No, this lady in the front here, I'll come to you. Well, you go first. 3 questions. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, a few years ago, I can't remember how long, there was the general consensus that the world is starving, I would say, or there's a lack of food. Has the world bridged that gap? Is there a net surplus or a deficit? And are we as South Africa plugged into where is the best place to send what food that we have a surplus in? And how does that dynamic then play? Because you find like Europe is like, they can't grow stuff half the year because it's so cold there. How does that dynamic then play out? Because then we can grow stuff and send. Are we still experiencing barriers in sending things they don't have?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take all 3 questions. We've got 10 minutes to go, so we're going to have to be quick in answering them. Yes, please go ahead. No. Afraid not.
Thank you. My name is Biandri Hubert. My question is what's it going to take to prioritize other aspects of trade as much as we prioritize tariffs? And again, I'm going to come from the SBS perspective. That's my field of interest and specialization. But we often talk about SBS in a barrier context. So talking about exporting into the continent, SBS is a barrier. But it's a very essential barrier. We can't have diseases and pests moving across borders at the rate that we export. So I suppose my question comes back to when are we going to start prioritizing that in South Africa in a more outward way? It is sometimes as difficult to get an answer or support out of the department for our own people, for South Africans to export, for South Africans to import products as it is for us to move into neighboring countries. And the communication on that point is sometimes equally bad. Finding out a day or two, a week or two later about something that's happened as opposed to immediately. So my question, I suppose, is just that, the prioritization of things other than tariffs. Being on discussion panels like this, for example, you know, SPS, as important as it is to the agricultural industry at the moment, if we look at foot and mouth disease, but that's the one big, broad, very clear example. We've got many, many other examples when it comes to plants and plant products as well. It's not just in the beef industry or in the dairy industry at the moment where these are essential. And then I think, Wandile, earlier you spoke about, you know, lecturing in the economics faculty. Or the fragmentation perhaps amongst government departments, because we do not have interdisciplinary teams sitting with legal, economics, science all together at the same table. We're all running around doing it in our own little fields, and then wondering why we're struggling to export when we are export focused perhaps in some sectors, but we haven't thought of the SPS aspects before we start negotiating the tariffs.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Prof. and panel. Quick question just from the grain sector. So we're a bulky commodity product, not that great to export, but we do want to participate in building economic growth and creating more jobs, and also the food security debate. We are a country, the earlier speaker referred to food shortages. We're a country where there's lots of grain, but there are people that are famished. Suffering from famine. So, but focusing on how do we get growth going. Back to the ad valorem moment, it's very quick to say that, okay, we get lots of protection when we least need it, when prices are high. But if we look at agricultural markets, prices are high when your fundamental costs are high. Your marginal income usually goes to the marginal costs. And that means, yes, there's a margin there, and obviously it's slightly easier. But I don't think we should write it off that easy or that quickly. I mean, why are we not looking more intensely at the ad valorem? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So any comments on those three? Please be brief.
I can quickly just talk about the balance, the world, just
food
production.
Balance, yeah, food security.
So if you think, let's talk a basic staple like maize. South Africa is currently probably the second or probably the cheapest source of maize currently in the world. We are trading at $190 if we put it in dollars. The US is trading at $220. African countries are trading at $300, $280, depending on which country you're at. But still, we have about 50% of our households who don't have enough food. So you have food, but you don't have food, and it's about the affordability. So you don't send food somewhere. Food is pulled in by an economy, and that's that's a tough reality around economic growth. So the economies in agriculture can do a lot to job creation, but we are, in relative terms, we can only do so much to help feed the nation and feed the world. But you need economic buying power to buy. So the whole, if you would rebalance supply and demand, and everybody would have economic income to the level of let's say middle income level person, then we could certainly produce a lot more food, if that makes sense. So then, in other words, there are more people that can buy, so you have a bigger demand, let's say for chicken or for pork.
It's the growth question.
It's the growth.
Right.
But if you don't have it, we are basically, our markets are filled.
Sure.
During the Russia-Ukraine war, when the prices ran high due to supply chains and a lot of production coming under pressure in Ukraine, what happened? We rapidly saw US, Brazil, Argentina, our farmers taking the gap and expanding. What is happening now? Production is at a high level and commodity prices have come down to such a level that farmers cannot produce. So you won't produce a ton of maize if you cannot make money out of it. And that's how these global markets work. So the question around, is there enough food globally? Yes, there is, given the ability to buy it. It doesn't mean that you're food secure if there's a bag of maize if you cannot afford it.
Sure.
I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Ferdy. Any other comments on the three questions?
20 seconds.
Yes, 20 seconds.
The reason we prefer that, Tobias, is only because of the limits and the level of protection you may be able to have. The variable may be able to offer you predictability, but you may hit the roof too quickly, and also there may be policymakers' reluctance to raising the tariff too high, like what you have been able to see with poultry. But that's a deeper conversation, and I can say this publicly, that from an ITEC perspective, this is one of the most important things, but we'll deal with the other things off record. Last 10 seconds that I have, South Africa faces an issue of income poverty. It's not the issue that our bread, you can put the loaf of bread, now the loaf of bread is at 18 Rand, you can drop it to 10 Rand, but if I have no money, I have no money. Job creation comes part of that. Those that are not working, they can benefit from grants, remittances, but we need to create work.
Thank you. Anybody on this question in the front here?
It's very important. She's right. I agree. I agree.
I didn't understand the question, so I agree as well.
It's a scientific part.
It's a scientific question of crossing borders.
I mean, it's capacity to get it done.
I would say both. The key thing there, Prof, to emphasize is that the phytosanitary matters that she's talking about, alongside with also biosecurity, plant health and animal health. We're talking a lot about animal health now, but plant health is way more important. Plant diseases are way more disastrous than the animal diseases. They can wipe your field off overnight, so we need to pay attention to them.
You know, I remember, any last comment? I'm going to give you each two last thoughts. But I remember during Codesa 2, or after Codesa 1, the ANC withdrew from negotiations. And the Star had a cartoon of Mr. Mandela then and President de Klerk in the canoe in a very choppy sea. And because the ANC had withdrawn, de Klerk leans over to Mandela and says, "Your side of the canoe is leaking." And what I've got out of this is we need the state, we need regulation, we need oversight, we need good policy, and we need the entrepreneurship and the energy of agriculture to come together. And this is a lifelong challenge. Nobody gets this very easily. And it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, there's still a lot more to do that can be done. Anyone want to make a last quick 30-second comment?
Yep. I think government needs to focus a lot more on execution and a lot less on creating very clever new policies. You've just got to sometimes do the job and do it really well, rather than endlessly trying to compensate for one, poor execution on one policy by creating yet another policy, which is where we find ourselves at the moment.
Last thought?
Yeah, Prof. So I think the opportunities are there. I think we've highlighted China, EU, consolidate the Far East, so the opportunities are there. I think as banks, we have the ability to fund our farmers, and we're creative in how we're funding. I guess the issue is to finding the new markets where all of this produce can go to.
Thank you. Wandile.
Professor Johan Kirsten, who's sitting at the back, typically talk about getting the basics right. And I think he would share Don's sentiments that let's just do what needs to be done. Get the ports working. Municipalities try to make sure there's less corruption, and people who can do the job do it. Roads are paved, crime in rural areas is dealt with, and that could take us a bit far from where we are.
Lovely. Ferdy.
Nothing more to add. I had a lot of fun. I think when I give my 30 seconds back to the audience.
Can I thank you very much for inviting us And can I thank the panel on your behalf for their inputs? Thank you. Well done, gents.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
This was interesting.